The Young Radicals. All right, from Harlem, we have Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore, and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? We're going to see lots of lyrics in songs and poems by authors that are going to really question the times. Gil Scott-Heron, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. In my longer version of this PowerPoint, I have some of his poems in there. They do a really good job of kind of setting the mood for what it was like during this time. We have the Nation of Islam. Over there on the right-hand side, you see Malcolm X as he kind of ascends to the top of the Nation of Islam. Black nationalism. Eventually, Malcolm X will actually break with the Nation of Islam. In 1964, we'll kind of get into that in a little bit. But the difference here between what Martin Luther King Jr. was advocating for and what they were advocating for is that they wanted, I guess the best way to summarize it pretty quickly was they really wanted separate but equal. Okay, they wanted it to be equal. And Martin Luther King Jr. argued that being separate would inherently never be equal. And so a little bit different ideas on how to go about it. Nation of Islam supported, just going to black churches, just going to black schools, going to black businesses, and so on. So a little bit different. The Nation of Islam itself will have some problems with it. Ultimately, Malcolm X will be assassinated by somebody within the Nation of Islam. They're staying on the Kennedy assassination, the comments made there, and Muhammad's illegitimate children kind of made people question a little bit about what the Nation of Islam is all about. But the Ballad or the Bullet, it's about an hour-long audio text that, again, you can click on the link if you go through this. That's linked inside the Civil Rights, and you can listen to that. It's very interesting, gives pretty good insight into Malcolm X and what he was thinking. Malcolm X on the Hajj and conversion to Orthodox Islam in 1964. He has this revelation. He prayed with white people, with brown people, with black people, and he realized that, maybe they didn't need to be separated by races. And so one of the things in the Islamic religion is to take a Hajj or a pilgrimage to Mecca, which you see there in the lower right, and pray if you can afford it. When he did that, it kind of changed his perspective on things. It was that changing perspective that ultimately cost him within the Nation of Islam and kind of tore it apart and leads to his assassination. James Meredith, we talked about him a little bit before, going to Ole Miss. Should be a solidarity march from Memphis, Tennessee, struggling to talk today, to Jackson, Mississippi. He's wounded by a sniper. However, the march is continued by others, including Stokely Carmichael, who will go on to become a member of the Black Panthers. And there's Stokely Carmichael right there. Black power. We are oppressed because we are black. In order to get out of that oppression, we must wield or group power. And you'll see the text and audio of that speech is linked to in the version that is inside of the Civil Rights folder. But again, we're trying to kind of move a little bit quicker, so you just have to take my word for it. That is a pretty powerful speech. And certainly, if you want to go back and listen to it, you can. Black Panther Party, 1966. You see Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, Oakland, California. They openly armed themselves. They'll have a shootout with the FBI on a couple of different occasions, and local authorities as well. They were not into the whole sit-ins and nonviolent movement. It was an eye for an eye. If they were attacked, they would attack back. that kind of thing. Back to court. Loving v. Virginia, 1967, the court struck down anti-miscegenation laws. Okay, those were laws that were designed to keep people of different colors or races from marrying. Basically, it legalizes interracial marriage, so that's a big step. Swan v. Charlotte Meck, implementation of the Brown decision in citywide busing may be used to integrate schools. So you could use buses to transport kids back and forth of all colors. Regents of University of California versus Bakke in 1978. This is a little bit later, but still is kind of an instrumental case in the civil rights movement in that it did two things. Bakke was a white man who applied to med school and got turned down twice, even though his GPA was higher than any of the minority candidates who were accepted into med school those 2 years. The University of California had reserved, I think it was 15 or 16 spots for minority candidates due to all of the racial segregation that had been going on for years and years and years. And so this is kind of a affirmative action, so to speak. The court makes a split decision. And what's interesting about it is they say you have to accept Bakke, but yet it still sanctions affirmative action, saying affirmative action is legal to use. So it upholds the idea of affirmative action, but it prohibited quotas and required the University of California to accept Bakke. So it was kind of a win-win all around, but it's a pretty good indicator of the mood of the time in 1978, and that we are upholding one individual's right to go to college, but still continuing on with affirmative action as well. All right, decade of assassinations. Edgar Evers, assassinated in 1963, civil rights activist. JFK assassinated 1963, obviously President of the United States. Lee Harvey Oswald, who was JFK's assassin, is killed by Jack Ruby. All right here, Jack Ruby is shooting him on his way to court. So Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated in 1963. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965, again by other members from within the Nation of Islam. Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated in 1968 by James Earl Ray. Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother and former Attorney General, who was now a presidential candidate, also assassinated in 1968. All of those assassinations really culminated in what's generally considered in American history to be kind of one of the most tumultuous generations. The 1960s with the civil rights movement, Vietnam is in full swing. You don't know this yet, but in 1968, the Tet Offensive was a huge push by the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese Viet Cong. The American public had thought we were winning the war, and that takes place when we realized we weren't winning the war anymore. And really, the whole decade, or that whole generation, really is kind of turned on its head. So multiple assassinations, obviously what's going on in Vietnam, the civil rights movement, everything like that makes the 1960s probably one of the most tumultuous decades. All right, some of the contributions. With civil rights and integration, we have legislation and cooperation. The legislation is put in place to kind of force cooperation. Cooperation is slow in many parts of the South. Black power, black nationalism, using psychological ploys, I guess, if you will, pressure on the government and more moderate civil rights organizations. Again, Martin Luther King Jr. would be considered one of the more moderate civil rights organizations. They were putting pressure on them. to push harder. They didn't want civil rights 10 years from now. They wanted it now. All right, it's a much more immediate type of action. And one of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. was trying to avoid, he realized that if the movement becomes violent, then he won't be able to garner the sympathies of the rest of the country. And quite simply, there just aren't enough people sympathetic to the cause to create legislative change if they can't get support from other parts of the country. Southern Strategy and Law and Order. There you see Richard Nixon, Republican candidate. He's going to win the presidency. We'll talk about him here in a little bit. 1964 election, South goes Republican, and this is a backlash. And we've talked a little bit before about the switch between, Democrats being conservative to being more liberal, and Republicans from being liberal to being more conservative. And that really happens probably in the 1910s, 1920s, somewhere around there. But this is really the end of the Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, if you will. We talk about how that Democratic Party at one point in time, the money and the power came from the old Southern planters, and that idea and way of life, that has shifted. All right, the Democratic Party no longer really has anything to do with that, and we see the shift here and Republican candidates being more appealing to those types of people in the South, or that platform, I should say. I shouldn't say those types of people, but that platform in the South. So Goldwater ran against Lyndon Johnson. Goldwater was a Republican candidate. You'll notice that he picks up like 5 or 6 states in the South, and that was kind of a big deal. Nixon's electoral victories. So here we see in the 68 election up there, Nixon appeals widely across the country, and now we kind of see that power base of the Democratic Party being the New England area. Texas still votes Democrat. Minnesota will almost always vote Democrat, which is really unusual in the 72 election when you look down there. But notice that, again, we had kind of a split because we had Wallace running, George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama, and a pretty big segregationist. I guess that's the most polite way I can put it. He's capturing votes in that deep South there, but not very many votes for Humphrey. And Humphrey is from Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey. The old Hubert Humphrey Metrodome was named after him. So you can see why, obviously, Minnesota votes for Humphrey. The 72 election, obviously Nixon wins in 68, 72 election. Nixon wins in a landslide. The irony here is, well, he wins in a landslide for 2 reasons. 1, he's working on getting us out of the Vietnam War. 2, the civil rights movement is, I would say, calming down. There's been gains in the Civil Rights Department. Integration is by and large happened throughout most of the South. And so that's not as big of a hot button issue as it once was. Really, Vietnam is the biggest hot button issue. And Nixon is promising to get us out, and he wins in a landslide. But it turns out he cheated a little bit. So that's going to kind of come back to bite him as he authorized a break-in into the Watergate Hotel, into the Democratic Party headquarters to try to steal their campaign secrets. And the reality is he didn't even need them. So he won in a landslide. He would have never even had to have done it. But he did. And he will ultimately become the only president in our nation's history to resign. All right, some of the government actions. Again, these are all things that we already went through. The executive branch, we saw FDR with Executive Order 8802, or 8802, I should say. Government contractors could not discriminate. Truman with the Committee on Civil Rights and Executive Order 9980 and 9981, which meant federal employment could not be discriminatory, and it integrated the armed forces. Legislative branch passes the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And the judicial branch, the Warren Court, as it's often referred to, with some sweeping civil rights decisions. McLaurin v. Oklahoma, Sweat Painter, and of course, Brown v. Board of Education. That is the end of our civil rights. The next thing I'm going to have you do is go through the Edpuzzle, and it will ask you, I think, 6 questions. And we'll talk about some of the things that I've covered, but we'll also add a little bit more insight too.